section of the course, which we dealt with the competitive environment that firms work in. Okay, so if we think about the competitive environment that firms work in, it really flows into one of three categories. The first category is something called perfect competition. I'm going to switch to this now, just bear with me. The first category is perfect competition. Now, perfect competition is a theoretical construct where we have all kinds of sellers and all kinds of buyers, and we're living in a world in which everybody is equal, information is widely available, the products that sellers are selling are identical, and people are really indifferent to one product supplier over another. So in terms of perfect competition, it's a theoretical construct. It doesn't actually exist, okay? It is a pure form, as monopoly is a pure form, and those two extremes don't exist. So that's the first extreme we looked at, and the other extreme we look at, as I say, is the monopoly, and the monopoly is on the other end of the side of the rainbow. And basically, a monopoly is one supplier. One supplier makes up the industry, and if you don't buy from that supplier, you don't buy at all. And again, monopolies don't strictly exist. They're very hard to find a perfect monopoly where one organization has absolute control of the market. The third thing that we looked at was this middle ground between perfect competitive markets and monopoly type markets, and it's called imperfect competition. And imperfect competition is really defined by two broad categories too, be it monopolistic competition, where we have lots of firms, small, relatively small, but they're competing by differentiating their products from one another. And that imperfect competition is really generally the markets that we actually operate in. And the other component of the imperfect competition is the oligopoly. And the oligopoly is when you have several large firms have a fairly large portion of the market. So it's not a monopoly. There are choices, but limited choices. And the products are pretty identical. The first thing we looked at was this perfect competition. And here's what you need to take away for the purposes of the exams. You want to know exactly what perfect competition is, okay? So if we look at perfect competition is really many firms within what we call the industry, which is the collective name of all the firms, and that they operate what's called in a market where buyers and sellers can get together. So, as I say, it's common, identical products. And if we look at the definition of it, there really are four types of markets, but specifically focusing on perfect competition, there's numerous sellers selling identical products. Getting in and out of the market is really easy because anyone can hang up a shingle and start. The seller's control over the price is non-existent because it is a purely competitive market. And the closest we have is commodities. So, for example, oil, wheat, these things that are sold into the world market. So we have lots and lots of sellers across the world selling this type of product. If we think about perfect competition specifically, which is really what this chapter dealt with, you want to be familiar with the characteristics as I just described. Many sellers, identical products, very easy to get in and out. Sellers have no control over price, and commodities such as oil. So we got this basic criteria that we need to establish for it. Many buyers and sellers, no preferences, firms can easily enter, and we compete for people's attention. And people supposedly have full information so they can make good choices. In a perfectly competitive market, you're going to notice, and this is important, that the demand curve is flat, meaning that no matter what the price is, and the price is say $20 in this particular instance, the demand runs across there because really the market price is $20, and that's what you're going to buy it at. So there's no single influence for a firm. So we're looking at really a firm here. If we think about the the demand curve for a company. We can see some examples here of what tends to be more competitive, and that is commodities. And in Newfoundland, this is particularly troublesome because we live in a market where we sell a lot of commodities. You know, we're a producer. As a producer, we're producing fish, minerals, oil, electricity. These are generally commodities, and as a result, they're more perfectly competitive. We work in a more perfectly competitive market than anything else. And this is good from the buyer's point of view, but not so good from our point of view as a seller. So the couple of the things you need to take away in terms of the mechanics of it, since no individual firm controls the price, the price is really determined by the market, meaning that everybody is in it together, and the combination of supply and demand is going to dictate what the price is. The only real decision that the supplier has is what quantity is going to give us the greatest profit. So we need to, we're not setting the price, but we are setting our quantity to say, oh yeah, well, we need a quantity that gives us the maximum. So we've looked at these numbers too in terms of categories. You know, we got output, the price is standard throughout, and we have to understand what total revenue is. Price times quantity will give us total revenue. We have to understand what an average revenue, which is the total quantity produced, to give us divided by the price, that will give us an average, and our marginal, which is the difference between one level of output and another level of output. And effectively, what you need to take away in a perfect competitive market is that total revenue, average revenue, and marginal revenue are the same for everyone and for every level of output. So this is the critical takeaway here, is that price, average revenue, and marginal revenue are always the same. So if we got a perfectly competitive firm, a perfectly competitive firm is going to operate in the area that maximizes its profits. So if we look at this particular graphic here, we're going to say, okay, where is our maximum profit? And if you consider that, well, minus 30 is loss, minus 28. So we see that the maximum profit occurs at 30. 30 is profit, and that's at 5 or 6, a level of 5 or 6 in terms of the competitive firm. And we can actually graph it, and we can see 2 break-even points, meaning that profit is 0 at 2 of these points, and the maximum profit occurs when it's furthest away. The total cost is lowest relative to the total revenue. We can see the effect of production on profits, and as we produce more, for example, we'll see how that affects on profits, and we can read that right off the chart again. We've also got this other approach, which is called the marginal approach to profitability, and effectively what we're looking at is our marginal revenue, and we're saying, you know, is our marginal revenue, as we sell more products, is our marginal revenue or extra revenue going up? Yes, it is. We can see marginal revenue as we add, we'll get $20 on each extra one. But the question is, well, when should we stop producing more? And the real answer comes in, if we look at a marginal approach, stop producing any more when the extra revenue that we get matches the extra cost of making that extra revenue. So when marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal, that's the time to stop producing anymore. So this marginal thing occurs at 6. And you can see it graphically illustrated right here. So the marginal approach is really just a simple look at how much extra do we make, how much extra does it cost. Okay, that's the basic takeaway from that. And we looked at some examples. So, you know, I'm not going to specifically ask you on the test anything related to math on this. The multiple choice, however, may have some mathematical computations, but in the questions, I'm not going to focus on that. So you need to know it, but you need to understand how the mechanics of it is done, but don't expect the particular question on it. You do want to be familiar with these couple of concepts, that is the break-even and the shutdown price. So effectively, the break-even price is the price where the company doesn't make any money. Its profit is 0. Okay, so that's essentially what we're looking there in terms of break-even. So we can see, for example, here that we got some output, We got what's called our average variable cost, our average total cost, and the price, and our marginal cost. And the break-even price is equal to the minimum average total cost. In other words, when we got our costs lowest, our average total cost, a total average total cost, we'll keep it lowest. That would be the point. So for any given price, the break-even outputs occur when average revenue equals the average total cost. Okay. Now, the maximum point of average, or the minimum point of average variable cost, is significant for two reasons. First, if the market determined price is below this, the firm should shut down, meaning it can't make enough money to cover its average variable cost. So this then defines what we call the shutdown price. If the market price is below the average variable cost, well, that's determined, that is the shutdown price. Okay, and that, you know, that is something that real firms have to produce, such as outcome chance. Minimum average variable cost. So there, that would define your shutdown price. So those are a couple of terminologies that you want to be familiar with. Okay, I won't get too keen on that. We did some examples of that. And again, what you want to focus on is the mechanics there. This chapter 9 is the next chapter. There were 2 chapters to do with perfect competition. Chapter 9, I would suggest, is the more, well, you need to understand chapter 8, but chapter 9 is the application of the concepts, okay? So we're looking at some of the issues with regards to this point of perfect competition. We talked about Adam Smith, and how he said, you know, that capitalism and perfect competition is great because the pursuit of self-interest will lead people to create harmony of interest. And, you know, the idea is that everybody's working hard to make the most money, and it's going to create the most benefit to us, because with the competitive environment that we live in, only the companies that are really good will survive. Government interference is not necessary, really, because the market will take care of itself. And the hands-off doctrine, or laissez-faire, we should be familiar with what laissez-faire is. Now, the question is that, in theory, according to Adam Smith, yeah, everything's rosy, but the reality is somewhat different. The pursuit of self-interest doesn't necessarily result in the best possible economy for everybody. Obviously, there are people who benefit from it, but there's some downside too. And so society can be endangered by companies seeking maximum profit. So government just stays away from, government is not hands-off totally, because there are some issues with regards to problems. This is probably the most important slide in the whole presentation. You want to be aware of what are the advantages and the problems of highly competitive markets, okay? So you need to be up on this. The first thing is, from an advantage, is the competition stimulates innovation. You know, companies are always fighting for market share. They have to come up with better ideas, and if you can build a better mousetrap, people will flock to your door, is the thing. So technological innovation is spurred on in a purely competitive environment. That's a big plus. Stiff competition also encourages firms to grow, so to capture economies of scale. Now, we also talked about later on the forces of competition. In order to grow, you have to buy up your competitors, and this is what we see as some of the challenges with competitive markets, is that, yeah, we need to capture a bigger part of the market, but in capturing a bigger part of the market, that means we're reducing competition, so they're no longer strictly purely competitive firms. Stiff competition forces surviving firms to be efficient as possible. You know, you've got to be what's called productively efficient, which is the production, so the use of technology, the use of people, and the use of the capital has to be very well considered. And allocatively efficient, meaning that the dollars are spent wisely. And because competition markets are because competitive markets are guided by the market, there's no need for anyone to be involved. That's a very important takeaway too. Government doesn't have to have a direct finger on the pulse of the economy. The economy will more or less manage itself. That's the theory of it, and that's a big advantage that Adam Smith dictated. And companies are free to enter and exit the market. Again, we talked about this freedom of entry and exit. So, you know, these are all considered as great advantages. But there are some problems, and we need to be aware of the problems. The advantages are, I'm going to call them self-evident. The challenges are not so self-evident. So in the long run, the number of firms entering the market to capture their share of opportunity, as long as a company is making $1 in this, in terms of $1 of profit, another company is going to look and say, hey, they're making $1 profit. And there's going to be, it seems so easy and it's so easy to get into the market. As long as someone can make $1 at this market, someone's going to say, I want to get into that market. So we're going to have infinite number of suppliers come into the market as long as there's money to be made. The problem is you're taking that pie of profit and you're slicing it thinner and thinner and thinner, meaning that eventually nobody's going to make any money. That's the theory of purely competitive markets in the long run. If we allow it to go on long enough, companies will enter the market until there's no money left to make, meaning nobody makes any money. The other argument against purely competitive firms is not everyone benefits equally. You know, some people without the right opportunity, skills, and luck are left behind. And generally we have wealthy owners and poor buyers. Competitive markets are very unstable. We witness it here in Newfoundland and Labrador now. Look at the price of oil. You know, absolutely unstable. In 5 years' time, price of oil might be up again. This is the problem with a resource-based economy. It's very much in a competitive market, as competitive can be, and this means that it fluctuates, and you get good and bad times. Competition is also compromised. This is why I talked about the forces of uncompetition there over on the other side. And there's absolutely no provision of public goods. You'll never have goods that don't make any money, like fire protection, if we had a purely competitive market. It just makes no sense. This is why government has to provide these public goods. And we also have something called externalities, and you need to be aware what externalities. Externalities are the negative impacts of business on the social and economic and political and environmental worlds of others. So, for example, pollution is a good example of companies. If companies are making money and they're in a purely competitive market, yeah, but what if they pollute? Who's responsible for that? What impact does it have on everyone else? So I've looked at these. In turn in these slides here. A little bit on the parade of giants, and this shows, you know, how the richest part of the country is the last very small portion of the population are super rich, and a great number of population are not so rich. We looked at this market instability thing, and you can see this is what's called the business cycle, where we see a constant up and down of the business cycle. And government's job is really to try to prevent massive swings in this. We talked about the forces of competition. I gave you the example of OPEC, which occurred in '73 when the OPEC oil crisis. They got together, the oil producing countries got together and jacked up the price of oil by reducing production. Public goods. We talked about this issue of public goods, and you know, public goods are goods that everybody benefits from. They're what's called non-rival goods, because if you use it, it doesn't affect my use of it. A lighthouse, for example. If you're looking at the lighthouse, I can look at the lighthouse too, and a million other people can look at the lighthouse. The fact that you're looking at it doesn't impact my ability to look at it as well. So public goods are also non-excludable, meaning you can't say you can't have it and someone else can. So that lighthouse, we can't block it away. Government sometimes gets into what's called quasi-public goods, which are not strictly public goods, meaning that they don't pass this test of non-excludable and non-rival. But for the good of society, education, for example, someone can create a private college. There's nothing to prevent a company from creating a private college. But government is into the college business because it feels that it provides some benefit to society. So you should be familiar with a quasi-public good. Externalities, we talk about pollution as the primary benefit, the primary cost of purely competitive markets, and pollution and consumption affects people's health. Some of the benefits that comes from externalities, like aesthetic benefits, you know, if a company produces flowers, a flower garden, and it looks pretty, that's a benefit to all of us. Or symbiotic benefits. So if I got a sawmill and the sawmill can help produce electricity for my town by burning the bark, that's what's called a symbiotic benefit. So what do government have to do in order to manage externalities? What do they do to deal with it? Well, they got really three options. You should be familiar with these three options. Legislative controls, put laws in place effectively to limit pollution. You can't produce any more than. Taxation, which is a fee that is applied to the company that can in turn be collected by government that is used to help clean up the mess. And cap and trade, which again is a form of legislative control that limits how much a company can actually pollute. And if companies want to produce more, they can buy extra credits from a company that doesn't produce so much. So for example, if another company doesn't use all of its capacity in terms of pollution, its limit, they can sell the rights to its limit to another company. So we've seen examples of this. Couple little terminologies there: marginal private costs, marginal social costs. This is the cost of producing one more unit. The private cost is to the firm. The social cost is the cost of it to society as a whole. And I've explained cap and trade there. I think that those are the key things that you should take away from that chapter, is the pluses and minuses of purely competitive markets and how we deal with them. So that's that chapter. Any questions there? Okay, I'm going to go look at the next chapter now. So the next chapter we looked at was what's called monopoly. And just like the previous chapter, a monopoly is an extreme case. And a monopoly is a typical market structure where we have a single firm making up the industry. Okay? It's a sole producer, no close substitutes. They are the industry. They're in a very powerful position. One of the things that you need to take away from monopolies is, how do monopolies get in place to start with? We looked really at a bunch of reasons, and these reasons are called, as a general rule, barriers to entry. In other words, what keeps another company from getting in on the job? And these barriers to entry come in three basic flavors: technical flavors, legal flavors, and economic flavors. From a technical point of view, a technical barrier to entry, it makes it difficult for other firms to duplicate the monopolist production methods, because the monopolist is really the sole owner of the resource or the particular technique. Sole ownership of the resource confers monopoly status on the producer. Similarly, a firm is a monopolist if it's the sole owner of the technology. So if it's the only company, IBM, for example, computers, Xerox and xerography, photocopies, those companies had a monopoly on that because they were only companies with the technology in the very early years, and they were the only ones who could produce it. So they basically had a monopoly, and that was what's called a technical barrier. And we also have legal barriers, and the legal barrier is a technical barrier that's created by government. Okay, so a legal barrier effectively is a right that is granted by government to a company to produce a given product for the market. So in this particular instance, in Newfoundland, for example, Newfoundland Power has been given the legal right to sell electricity in Newfoundland to consumers. They're the only game in town. And again, they have been given the legal right to do this, no one else. I cannot start a competing firm in Newfoundland and Labrador to sell electricity. So economic barriers deal with the idea of, it costs so much money to get into this business. It's difficult to set up a car company. Tesla, for example, started. We're all familiar with Tesla. They're producing electric cars, but they're having a darn of a time with servicing them. You can go buy a Tesla, but where's the nearest service? And the nearest service is a long ways from here. And the chances of it being set up anytime soon is slim, because there's not enough. It's a chicken and egg thing. You don't have enough cars to make it worthwhile to set up a service, yet you need service in order to sell more cars. So automobile industry tends to be a big, big issue with regards to this. You know, you need big dollars and big investment in order to get into that business. Now, just a little bit on the math of this. When we look at the total average and marginal revenues for the purely competitive firm, we saw that they're all the same. Monopolist, not so much. The monopolist really has control over the price, unlike in a purely competitive market. And the monopolist really has control over the price, but they don't have to control over how much they sell. You know, they can set their price and they'll sell more with a lower price, less with a lower price, higher price, but they don't have any control over it. So we've seen a similar type setup here where we're taking the price to total revenue and average revenue and the marginal revenue. And again, I'm not going to get too caught up in the mechanics of it, other than the fact that there is a downward sloping curve, demand curve, because as the price goes up, people buy less. So this, how do monopolists manage it then? Well, they can practice what's called price discrimination, where they basically charge different customers different prices. So industrial customers, for example, for electricity, get a better deal than we get. Here's the main takeaway that I want you to be aware of. What's so good about a monopoly and what's so bad about a monopoly? Well, what's so bad about a monopoly? Monopolies are criticized for being able to make economic profits indefinitely. If, for example, there's no competitors, there's no threat to a monopoly to lose its share of the market. So as a result, it can make economic profits indefinitely. They're both productively and allocatively inefficient. They don't need to be efficient. As long as they can make a profit is all their concern is. So there's no drive to get to the lowest possible cost in terms of productive efficiency, using the right tools to get the lowest cost, or using your dollars effectively. Monopolies too create an unequal distribution of income, as do purely competitive firms. But monopolies, well, he who owns all of the geese that lay the golden eggs make the money, and those who don't own those geese don't make the money. And effectively, monopolists have a lot of power over the market, so they can price discriminate. So, you know, monopolies just aren't up there with perfect competition because they're not efficient. They can charge higher prices, and they can produce lower outputs. The plus with a monopoly, the thing that you want to take away in terms of what's so good about a monopoly, well, they capture large economies of scale. Monopolies are big business. So as a result, they can get these economies of scale by getting largeness. They engage in extensive research. Because they have so much money and they're guaranteed profits, it means there's certainty there, and they can afford to spend money on research and development. And they offer relatively good wages. You know, again, because they're cash flush, they can afford to pay people. So what do governments do in order to manage monopolies? Well, governments can attempt to change the behavior of monopolies or manage the behavior of monopolies by doing some things. They can tax the monopolists, which is fair game. Okay. They can require the monopolists to sell at a specific price, so they basically set the price. Or they can nationalize, which means to make it a crown corporation, to make it owned by the government. So those are the key takeaways from the monopoly chapter. Any questions there?
Nope.
Okay. Well, finally, I'm going to look at the imperfect competition chapter. And when we talk about imperfect competition, we're really in this middle ground. So, you know, it occurs when an individual firm, by virtue of its size relative to the market, has some degree of control, and that varies from none to a good bit over the industry, quantity supplied, or the price. So, you know, as I say, here are the extremes that we looked at, and here are the kind of things we're looking at in this section. More towards the purely competitive environment, we have what's called monopolistic competition, where you have a bunch of small firms kind of represent that purely competitive environment. You have relatively easy freedom of entry and exit. You have some degree of control over price because you're large enough. You don't have an infinite number of firms in the market. And most importantly, you have differentiated products. Okay, those are key things that you want to be aware of for monopolistic competitors. From an oligopoly, what is it the key things that you want to be aware of? Well, there's few large firms, more like a monopoly, where there's only one large firm. Entry is difficult because, again, all of the same things that we looked at in monopoly that make it difficult to get in, the capital investment, all of these things, the technical barriers, the legal barriers, and the economic barriers also apply to oligopolies. There's non-price competition. A lot of competition going on in an oligopoly that has nothing to do with price. Our product is different, again, in dealing with differentiation. They have a relatively high degree of price control because there's so few of them. And they're all mutually interdependent, meaning that because there's so few of them, they all need to work together in order to ensure the market is overall satisfied. So firms operating in imperfect competition tend to have to compete. So there is a certain degree of competition. Most common way is through product differentiation. You want to be aware of what product differentiation is. Here are ways that we can make our product different. We can create logos, which basically tells the customer in a glance, well, who made this product. Distinctive brand names like logos, who made this product. Where the company is located. Are you right near the market? Price Club is over in Galway. That's where the new market is, because generally middle income families with kids tend to be who Costco is aimed at. Seniors are not going to buy that much stuff. They got their houses set up. They don't need to buy furniture and the like. They don't need to buy large boxes of cornflakes. So where is that market in St. John's? Well, the Galway area is attracting that type of, and Pearl is attracting that type of resident. So that's why they're there. So that would help. The levels of service. Costco has no level of service. That's part of the gimmick with Costco, is that there's no real service, and you're in a warehouse type setup. Whereas if you go down to Bogart's Jewelry or Diamond Design down Churchill Square, lots of service. That's how they differentiate themselves. Product development, they're always coming up with new ideas for products. And advertising. Advertising is kind of like a catch-all for all of these. You could argue that all of these are forms of advertising. And advertising has its tout its benefits, provides customers with lots of good information which consumers need in order to make good decisions. It enhances competition between firms. It lowers the price of products because of the competition. And it finances the magazines, TV shows, web channels, anything that does the advertising. Obviously, they're selling this. Others argue, no, advertising is on the contrary. It's non-informative, wasteful, encourages concentration, and it raises prices to the detriment of consumers. So you want to be familiar with these basic arguments. Okay, so monopoly competitive has 4 characteristics. And these are the things I want you to focus on. The industry is comprised of small firms, tends to be, relatively free entry and exit, some degree of control, and differentiation. The other extreme that we looked at, the other half of this, was oligopolies. Can be found in industries that produce differentiated products or standardized products, and they tend to be, larger. So what are some of the characteristics? Few large firms. Entry and exit is difficult. A lot of non-price competition. How can we differentiate ourselves? Each firm has a significant control over the price, and mutual interdependence. We saw that. We came up with this term concentration ratio, which measures really the top 4 firms in the business, in the industry, and says, how much of the total industry is owned by those top 4 firms. That's what concentration ratio is. And generally, all you need to know is that the higher the ratio, the concentration ratio, the more oligopoly it is. Less concentration is more purely competitive, more competitive market. There is a temptation to collude, and that all that means is that because of this competition in oligopolies, there's so few firms that they can easily get together and say, let's drive up our prices. If we work together, we can do much better. We can be more like a monopoly. And finally, we got this issue of the kink demand curve. And all the kink demand curve says that, if one firm in that oligopoly group or that imperfect competitive group drops their prices, every other firm will follow, meaning that prices below the natural price will be matched. And this gives a high-angled demand curve. However, if one firm tries to bring up your prices, odds are no one else is going to do it. So it's less likely for other firms to change their prices. So prices are not very elastic above and very elastic below the current price. So you should be familiar with what exactly that Kinked demand curve talks about. And again, airlines, same idea. They tend to be faced with this Kinked demand curve. So that is effectively a quick review. That is effectively a quick review of the things that we covered in that section. And I'm hoping that I've given you some good insights into what are some of the things I'll be looking for mostly. Any questions?
Nope, not right now.
Okay, well, you let me know if there is.
All right.
That's as far as we're going to go with this. And that will be our last class, actually, Jessica. If there are some issues or if the class wants to get together to discuss, but otherwise, I'm going to leave it to you guys to do your study. Okay.
Perfect.
Good luck. Thank you. Thank you very much for doing the course.
No problem.
Bye.
Bye.